Okay, now we're live. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. The show about the use of police force. And I'm Paul Swearingen. I'm the host of the Nonpartisan Evangelical Podcast, along with Lauren D'Amico here, who heads up Intersecting Faith and Politics, a Facebook group. Why don't you give us the address to that, Lauren, and say hi to us real quick. Glad to see you here today.
Hi, yeah, this is Lauren D'Amico. So we're Intersecting Faith and Politics. We're creating a safe space for religious-minded discussion on politics at facebook.com/group/intersecting faith and politics.
Yep. Or you can just go search Intersecting Faith and Politics and the Nonpartisan Evangelical pages on Facebook as well, and YouTube and all that other good stuff. So we felt like in this topsy-turvy world and the times going on, it's always good to get people together and start having discussions and thoughts and understanding. And so we thought we'd pull a group of people together. And so this is kind of our Joe the Plumber group, if you will, just some guys. None of us are police experts in how police handle. We're just citizens of America talking together. And so that's why we pulled everybody together, just to get a feel for what's going on and how we can support one another through it. So welcome, guys, to the discussion. And we're just going to go around the horn real quick here to start off. And just tell us your name and where you're from and sort of how you're feeling and just your basic sense of what's going on with our law enforcement and what you would like to see happen in this day. And so, David, why don't we start with you?
All right. Thank you, Paul. My name is David Plasman. I'm from Fresno, California. I'm a retired social worker. I worked 33 years in county social work here in Fresno and learned a lot in that particular process. I currently train new social workers for the Central California Training Academy. I'm speaking today as a private person if they're watching.
Good to note.
Just make sure we get that qualifier in there. How I'm feeling. Lots of feelings, jumbled feelings. One of the things I did to prepare is I wanted to kind of look at the names of persons who have been impacted by lethal force in policing, and thinking I want to make sure I could kind of be on top of what those names are. That is an impossible task. Since George Floyd, there have been dozens and dozens and dozens, and not just this most recent one with Jacob. So I'm a little taken aback by that. The other thing I'm sensing, though, and I think this is maybe more important, is that in my work in social work and county government, is I really always understood, I shouldn't say always, but I began to understand that the challenges were as much about the system as it was about individuals. That as individuals, you could be really good social workers, you could really do your job well, but you might not be doing right by people. And in fact, because the work has evolved over all those years, I looked at the work that I did in the 80s and 90s, and it wasn't very good, but I was doing what the system wanted me to do. So I think the same thing is true for law enforcement officers. Most, if not, well, I can't say all, because there's no such thing as all, but most officers are really, really good people. But good people, even good people, can't overcome a system that puts them into a particular position or a situation or trains them to do it in a certain way. Because in fact, whatever you're getting out of your systems is what you are creating the system to do for the people that you serve. And that was the same thing in social work as it, I think, is in law enforcement. So in being at all critical, if that's a good word to use, of what's going on, it's not about individual officers. Now, there's going to be a couple of individual officers. I don't know them, so it's really up to the systems to deal with that. But it's really more about the system that I'm frustrated in, the system that needs to change. You could have perfect people in there. If the system drives them to do things in ways that are detrimental, that's what it is. And so I look for system change.
That's a great way to start us off. And how about, let's just all, none of us are anti-cop here. All of us appreciate the work these men and women do for us, that they leave their house in the morning. And sorry, my dog is joining the podcast now. They leave their house in the morning and sometimes may not come home at night. And that is sacrifice for us all. So can we all shake our heads? None of us are anti-police on this discussion. We're all just kind of discussing, is there something else we can look at? So Gary, welcome to the show and discussion. And why don't we have you go next?
Sure. My name is Gary Halverson. I was a former Air Force security police officer. So I have 4 years of experience as a military police officer in the law enforcement area. I served in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy. And essentially the duties of the law enforcement officer in the Air Force is essentially the same as what you see in community policing. We handle all requirements for law enforcement in our communities. And as you know, if you know anybody in the military, base is basically a self-functioning community, has everything that you would need there, from your base exchange to your housing. So we dealt with everything that a community police officer would. So where I speak from today is just being a former police officer, something I enjoyed doing very much. And what I'm seeing today is very heartbreaking, and what we see on the news night after night of how lives are being lost. It's absolutely tragic, and there definitely needs to be a look into why is this happening? Why is this occurring? How did we get to this place? Is training been taken a back seat on certain things? Is there political codes of silence that are preventing change from happening? I guess that's what we need to look into. But from my perspective, it's absolutely tragic, and we'll get into more discussions, I'm sure, tonight about the how this is happening. What's the thought patterns behind it? What my perspective is on how law enforcement approaches things. I know we've got some good topics coming up, but I just beside myself sometimes watching what we see. Watching the George Floyd it's unbelievable that would even occur with that length of time. From my perspective, it may be just as angry as anybody else, because it should have never happened.
Great. Appreciate you sharing that to get us started. Brian, you introduce yourself next.
Hi, I'm Brian Kleinhammer. I'm an evangelical pastor with an online ministry at kingdomculture2.com. The main focus of my ministry is to help equip, enable, and network average, ordinary people to become kingdom culture leaders in their own ministry. Also, to provide a better understanding of the social justice aspect of the gospel of Jesus Christ. One of the things that I've been made more aware of is not just what's happening now, but the road that has brought us here. Understanding the history of law enforcement in our country, how it was created, under what circumstances it originated, and draw a line from that to where we are today in order to better understand where we want to be tomorrow. I am fully pro law enforcement, pro police officer. I do believe that the average police officer is essentially a good, decent person who wants to serve their community. But the culture that they are placed in, from the academy to several years on the force, does provide a type of cultural expectation of behavior on their part. And that cultural expectation creates a narrative where they may look at things a little differently than they did before joining the law enforcement career. So what I'm hoping to do is to look at the history, compare it with scripture, compare it with decency and a love of humanity, and see where it takes us.
All right. Thanks, Brian. And Lauren, you're up.
Yes, I'm Lauren D'Amico, currently in Madison, Wisconsin. Grew up evangelical, grew up largely at Bethel Church in Northern California, and very much steeped in the revival movement. Had an interesting experience several years back of being challenged by a much more liberal friend, which resulted in an article I wrote called The Makings of a Liberal Evangelical. So I now kind of go by that title, active blogger, director at a consulting firm, real estate investor, still very much a Christian. And got connected with Paul here a while back, and so I blog on his site, and also help co-lead a Sunday night group that we do for taking communion as believers as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, glad to have you guys all here. And my name's Paul Swearingen. I live in Fresno, California, and started Nonpartisan Evangelical. Story similar to Lauren's, begin to be challenged in sort of that conservative thought and begin to think, wow, does this sort of Christianity line up with the Jesus I'm seeing in the Bible? And that began to start this journey that changed things up a little bit. And so it's led to discussions like these. So guys, welcome and thank you. And anybody watching us on Facebook Live, make comments, you can ask questions, and we'll try to get to them as we can. And we're going to try to keep this all happening in the next 50 minutes here. So, but feel free to chime in with us on the discussion. And so let's just open it up, guys. And let's start with this. Like, when do you believe police use of lethal force is justified? When is it okay for an officer to pull the weapon out of the holster and start to release the ammunition in there? And Gary, maybe since you have some experience around this, why don't we just start with you? When do you feel lethal force is justified for a law officer?
It was definitely one of the top things that we had trained on initially. There, for us, it was, and I speak from my experience, there was 3 preconditions that needed to be met in order to use deadly force. The 3 preconditions would be intent, opportunity, and capability. So obviously, capability would mean they have some type of weapon that is capable of inflicting serious bodily harm or death. You know, a weapon, a gun, a knife. Capability would mean they have the ability to shoot that weapon. If it's a knife, they have the ability to actually reach and harm somebody. So there's a distance thing with that one. In intent, they need to show that they have intention to kill or seriously hurt somebody. So they're saying, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill somebody. Those 3 preconditions are what we based everything around on the use of deadly force. If those weren't met, you weren't covered, you weren't authorized to use deadly force. So now you take those three preconditions and you think something has to be, a decision has to be made in a split second, typically, right? So how do you process those 3 things in a split second? And from our perspective, we trained constantly all the time. Every week we were training, and they had what they called a shoot, don't shoot scenarios, where you actually would be presented with this big screen, television screen with your weapon would be, with a laser, and you would actually be presented scenarios where you would be like you're there having these conversations with individuals, and all of a sudden somebody pull a gun, or somebody would act like they pull out a phone or something like that, and you'd have to decide, was that a situation where I would use deadly force? And aside from the use of deadly force, obviously you should also say, every intention, at least the way we were trained, you are there to de-escalate every situation as much as possible. De-escalation is the name of the game. And, some of what we're seeing today, the videos that you see, maybe don't paint the entire picture, but you definitely see a lack of de-escalation on some of these incidences that have happened. And there's a critical aspect to that. You do not want to get to the point where you have to make that split decision, right? So de-escalation, and there's a lot of non-lethal tools. So maybe that's part of the discussion. Where is this training happening? Why is this not occurring?
And I would assume being in that situation is probably fairly rare. So it's kind of difficult for officers to make that decision in that split moment. Nobody's saying this is an easy thing, but who else wants to jump in? What's your thought on when lethal force is justified in law enforcement?
So Paul, I can jump in. So one of the things I found interesting with this is how disparate our rules are as a country. Because I Googled, when is lethal force justified? And the thing that came up, and I'm actually going to go ahead and screen share this here, if you can give me the ability to do that here, Paul. But the thing that I found was the rules regarding specifically at a nuclear base, or I think it was a nuclear power plant. And so it was interesting reviewing these and comparing them to what you were saying, Gary. And so there certainly some similarities, certainly some differences. So it was interesting here. They were saying, it has to be in self-defense when it appears necessary to protect the protective force officer, basically their equivalent of a police officer, who reasonably believes him or herself to be in imminent danger, serious offenses against other people. And then there's all these things about nuclear. But the other part that was interesting at the beginning here was, again, like you were saying, Gary, that it's only justified under conditions of extreme necessity when all lesser means have failed or cannot be reasonably employed. And so again, to kind of echo what you were saying, Gary, as I've looked at these situations that have occurred, I'm going, I feel like we're failing that test fundamentally of, have all of these lesser means failed, or, or have they even attempted to be employed? And it was interesting as I looked at some of the other cities to see, what are their standards, and there was a lot of variance. But to me, I kind of agree with this standard, and what you were saying, Gary, of really this should be the absolute last step of we've tried everything else, or we don't think there's anything else to try, but we are really sure this person's about to kill somebody, and the only thing we can do is kill them to prevent that from happening.
And Brian and David, it sounded like both of you felt systemically it's sort of maybe there is something underlying that would drive an officer to make to jump more quickly at that time when there's no other option than to go to lethal force, perhaps. So I don't know if either of you want to jump in on that next.
So Brian mentioned history, and so one article that I read recently that was really helpful in that regard, I won't share my screen, but I'll just kind of put it up here so it is real. The Invention of the Police Force. It was in New Yorker. It's available online, but it talked about the history of policing in the United States. And it was interesting because, I wasn't around in the 1700s. And so I just imagined that we've always had police, but we didn't. We didn't have police. We had some kind of civil order that came from government, but really not much policing. Policing then started with really dealing with runaway slaves. So that was really one of the starts. And then in the mid 1800s, then there was actually the first police forces in Boston and some other places, which often were there to deal with immigrants of other kinds, and then also unions and labor strife and other kinds of things. So it was about controlling people. And then it was in the 1900s in Berkeley, the first police force that really became more that military model, where it was really about, and there were some awful things said about that. Basically, there's an enemy out there and we need to get them. And so I think that became, one of the things that then contributes to the challenge of law enforcement today is that sort of idea of it's a war out there. And the reality is it kind of is. Because of the amount of weaponry that's out there as well. So it is kind of that level of threat. But also you think about in war, especially current like conflicts that we have, for many persons, when you're combating someone else, those people don't look like you. If you're in the Middle East, they're Middle Eastern, and if you're not, they're not, so you're kind of used to the conflict being against people that are different than you, and maybe it's okay, or there's less of a compunction toward actually using lethal force because of that. Even the most noble people, including myself, have what's called implicit bias, which is a different reaction to persons based on other things like color or national origin or whatever. There's lots of levels of implicit bias. I took the Harvard implicit bias test, and it showed a lot more than I would want to have. I have no outward bias, and if I do, I deal with it. But implicit bias then becomes a bit of a problem. But the last thing I really wanted to mention was the fact that there is trauma out there, trauma, both personal trauma as well as societal trauma. And so in a law enforcement interacting with someone, it's kind of needing or wanting to control the situation and have cooperation. That's actually can be a trigger in the other direction, even for persons who aren't worried about warrants that they have or they're high or any of that kind of stuff. It's just that they just want to get out of there because they're concerned that what will happen to them was what they've seen happen to so many others. So there's a need, I think, for better understanding of trauma and trauma responsiveness, and being able to include that in not just de-escalating, but I think just the presence of law enforcement sometimes is an escalating event. So those are just some of the thoughts that I have.
Let me make sure. So kind of what you're saying there, perhaps if I can summarize, if a black man feels, if I get in that police car, I'm never coming home again, that's been the experience, then some of us in the world are saying, why didn't they just do what the cop told them to do? If they wouldn't have been shot. But the trauma that they've understood from their community causes a different reaction than maybe you or I might.
And many a person has cooperated and been killed. The most egregious, well, they're all egregious, but the most heart-sickening one for me was there was a man who was African-American who was a therapist who was dealing with his client, and I'm sorry, I don't remember his name, but he was dealing with his client lying on the ground with him and trying to calm him. Police officers came and raised their weapons toward him. He put his hands up and they still shot him.
Hmm.
And he was trying to help somebody.
Wow.
But it's that perceived dangerousness of somebody that looks different than you that comes from centuries of our country having to mythologize the dangerousness of Black persons to justify Jim Crow laws and slave trade and all of that kind of stuff. So there's a lot I could say about that. But
Somebody else was about to jump in there.
No, I was just going to say that I definitely think agree with it, that the fact that like mental health isn't really talked about much with regards to law enforcement or criminal activity. Mental health is such a stigma to it, even though like everybody has some sort of mental health like issue of some sort, whether you've battled with depression or you've battled with having a challenging time that life brings. If you've raised kids, you know what it's like to have a challenge, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I, you question yourself. And, bringing that into the discussion, I think, is absolutely critical at this point nationwide for both how law enforcement approaches things. To your point, it may be triggering just having a uniformed police officer show up because maybe somebody's history of that has been all negative. Nothing good can come from that. The other side of it is you did mention, David, that there was a an enemy type of mentality or military type of mentality, and I don't agree with the police departments having military style looks or anything like that. I think the military should be the military. And when I served in the military, which is kind of funny, right? So I served in the military as law enforcement. We wore our dress blues, which was more of a professional blues look. It wasn't our camouflage gear, our BDUs. So, but our days spent, a lot of our time was spent community policing, meaning I could be sitting in the morning at a crosswalk at the school and making sure that nobody's racing through the school zone as the kids are trying to get, talking to the kids as they're coming, helping them walk across the street, getting out in the community. Every Halloween, we were out in the community helping, keep it safe, just so that there wasn't, everybody could walk around freely. You would be out there, interacting with them. And the community policing is not a new idea, but I feel like it's getting more and more challenging to do as there becomes more of a divisiveness between, what we're seeing on television, what we're seeing actually happening with law enforcement that's gone south, that's gone awry, that should never happen. It's making it difficult to build that relationship in the community that needs to happen. And my perspective going into it always was to serve and to protect. Those two items. First was to serve. Second was to protect. The job of law enforcement, in my opinion, police, is to serve the community. You're there to serve people. It's meant to be a selfless job. And you're there to protect secondarily. So when we get far away from that and become this, we're there to, put people in jail. We're there to, have that mentality. I think that's the wrong approach.
Brian, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I agree with what David said about the presence of implicit bias. Interesting thing is, and I know that this isn't a situation that we're only facing today, but I think today we're seeing implicit bias being manufactured on a scale that has been hitherto unheard of since the beginning of law enforcement in our country. It's being manufactured in order to reinforce some of the stereotypical views that law enforcement must be, if you are for law enforcement, you must unequivocally support the actions of all police officers. If there's a shooting, you must assume there was probable cause. If you're told otherwise, you should be skeptical about it. If you are being drawn into sympathy for the victim, then that implicit bias is again reinforced by talking about perhaps some of the lifestyles that the victim made. In other words, victim shame. We've seen that a lot throughout the years where
they brought it on themselves, right?
They brought it on themselves. They cheated on a 5th grade test. They may have smoked pot when they were in high school, something like that, and it reinforces that implicit bias where law enforcement is there to protect us. And I think if we look closer, we're seeing that the us is not everyone. It's us. It's those who are culturally in power, those people who are at a place where they can unequivocally support law enforcement because they have that privilege. And we're calling it white privilege, but it could also be economic privilege and other privileges we've seen. I think that generally speaking, the church has been too silent about this bias in order to maintain compliance and civility, and also not to offend members who are pro-law enforcement because of their political ideology. I think the church has a lot to make up for. Better late than never, but I think we're still waiting for the church to stand up and saying, no, we do support law enforcement, but we must recognize where our silence has brought us to this point. We must acknowledge that the people who are protesting this are not going out simply because they're destructive and they want to cause damage. They're going out because they recognize that human beings can only be pushed, and they can only be disenfranchised for so long and so harshly until they've got nothing left to lose and say, what must I do to make you hear me? Because nothing has worked so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like we're all in agreement that, you know, a unloading a weapon in a police interaction with a citizen is a breakdown of the system. We don't want that to happen. So what has to change even in the philosophy of law enforcement? What is the obligation of an officer to protect us through even use of lethal force if necessary, or to protect themselves as well, which is part of the standards as well? Lauren, I don't know if you have any insight on how do we need to change a philosophy of law enforcement altogether?
So I have a friend who studies Aikido, and which is a form of martial arts, and he expressed a concept to me that was really interesting. And I don't know if it's prolific through martial arts, but it was certainly true in Aikido. And it was basically the concept that as the Aikido student or practitioner or whatever, if you're being faced with somebody who's trying to harm you, your role is actually to protect that person and yourself. And it's really interesting because you compare it to other forms of other martial arts, other forms of fighting, and your role is to protect yourself at the expense of that other person oftentimes. And I looked at that and I went, wow, what if our police force felt that, you know, that person coming at me with a knife who wants to kill me, my role is actually to protect them and me. It's not just to protect me. And so what would it mean if we shifted that mentality and said, no, the serve and protect doesn't end when the person threatens you, that it still is part of that serve and protect to protect that person that is threatening you. And it was interesting reading in the UK, because they have 9 standards of policing of policing by consent that were dated from years ago. And a lot of it kind of references to that. There's one thing that they mention that says to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. The police being only members of the public who are made to give full attention to duties which are incumbent on every citizen in the interests of community welfare and existence. And you can find that at gov.uk. But it was interesting to read that and go, wow, this is such a different picture of policing than what we're seeing now, where it really is the police aren't members of the public is not members of the police. These are in fact 2 completely distinctly different groups interacting with each other. The other thing to kind of mention off of what Brian had said, when I've heard a lot of the Black Lives Matter groups and affiliated groups, and they're talking about, you know, what does it look like to defund the police or to reduce the funding for the police? And a few of them have mentioned it looks an awful lot like the suburbs. And it's interesting because I looked around and I went, yeah, in the suburbs, I don't interact with the police. And a friend of mine cited a stat, and I don't have the site for it, but I think it's probably at least somewhat close. And I think they said that there's roughly around 400 million encounters between citizens and police members a year. And I went, that's roughly one per person per year. And I went, I'm 32. I think I've had maybe 5 encounters with police, which means somebody somewhere has had almost 60 to make up for my lack of encounters. And going, yeah, I've grown up in an environment where I do have, like Brian said, the privilege to be able to say, yeah, police are wonderful, because I never see them. I never have to interact with them. I don't have to interact with them as a nuisance or as a threat.
And I think some of that goes to historical trends. And this is where we get to be nonpartisan, because this is going to be about Democrats. And I'm a Democrat, just to say. So in the 80s, Clinton and others, in Reagan even before him, moved to a community policing idea, not the community policing that Gary is talking about, which is where you develop relationships and become partners, but community policing, the broken window policy, I think it was called, where you make sure that you control every little thing so it doesn't get out of control. And then they moved all sorts of money from preventative and resourcing kinds of things for communities into law enforcement. And that's when we began to burgeon our jails and prisons with lots and lots of people. And even candidate Joe Biden was a big part of that. So this isn't, like I said, I'm a Democrat, so you can maybe guess who I'm voting for. But even Joe Biden was a part of that. So, and then no persons are like pretty on this because of that kind of dynamic of what policing was doing. And then what happened is the proportion of African Americans in prisons became much greater than their proportion in the population. So then it became the idea that that's because African Americans do a lot more crime, when in fact it was about unequal or uneven enforcement and policing processes. The crimes that happen in the suburbs, didn't get the same treatment as in the areas where persons of color lived.
And I think that does come back to mindset of us as a culture. Again, in a recent election in our city of Fresno, there was a debate and I think we have like 900 police officers in our city of 500,000 people. And so one of the candidates was like, I'm going to get us to 1,000 cops on the street, and the next candidate was like, I'm going to get us to 1,500 cops on the street. And it's like, is 3,000 the number? The law and order has become a big political weapon. And does that, again, not speak to our mentality? And I think, Lauren, you're talking about this, that in the UK and other places, there are different mentalities. Do we look at taking down some of the weaponry? Should we have cops that don't carry guns on their hip, but maybe have it in the cruiser, so it's a little bit more difficult to react? Is there anything we change as a philosophy of people that could help solve some of this problem?
Paul, if you don't mind, I want to actually just jump back really quick to something else David just said, and referencing back again to the UK. One of the other things that they mention in that standards of policing by consent, as their number 9, is to recognize always that the test of police efficiency is the absence of crime and disorder, and not the visible evidence of police action in dealing with them. And so again, really to just highlight the point that David made of, there's been so much measuring based on, we've got more people in the prisons, we're making more money off the prisons. A lot of these are for-profit organizations, and going, we have the whole incentives all backwards, and we've got to focus on how do we bring down crime, not how do we bring money to the policing organizations. But Paul, to your question, and I'll let somebody else go as well, but that's definitely a question I've been asking myself is, how, if you're pulling somebody over for speeding, do you need to have a gun? We already know if you're going around and writing up tickets for parking violations, a lot of times they don't have guns for those types of things. But something like speeding, you probably don't really need to have a gun, and maybe you don't even need to have the person actually be pulled over. We can mail them a ticket. But going, how many of those things could we just reduce back the amount of guns that even need to be available and in police hands? And Gary, I'm very curious to hear your response to that.
Well, if you want to move towards a totally autonomous, let's mail tickets and not have interactions, I think that's the better route to go. The challenge with, I honestly, traffic stops are one of the most high risk situations a cop can put himself into, because you don't know who's in that vehicle in front of you, and you don't know if there's, somebody that's has a warrant out for their arrest that is an immediate danger that something happened. And the idea of trying to, when can we have law enforcement not be armed? And like some other countries, I don't know how that would work in our country, in this country, in the current state of things. Like I said before, when we would in the morning, I could be at a crosswalk for the school and helping the kids cross the street. And one scenario that I did have, I was doing that. I was, making sure that people weren't, racing through the school zones so the kids won't get run over. And then later, within a couple hours from that, had to respond to a suspect with a gun that ended up being a murder-suicide at one of our base exchanges. So how do you, transition from where you wouldn't need it to when you would need it in those types of scenarios? That's I think the challenge. I think, you can have those discussions and try to, figure out how you would do that. In practical use, it'd be very difficult. I think the discussion needs to change more towards like what we've talked about before, like, mental health, bias. Where is this coming into play with the scenarios that we're dealing with? And, incarceration, like we talked about it, like if the goal is to fill up the prisons, I think that's, like you said, absolutely the wrong goal. And if incarceration worked, we wouldn't have crime rates that we have today. So where's the discussion on the mental health? We have, in our family, we do have one of my nephews that's incarcerated right now. He was driving and he killed 2 people, and he had some substances in his system from days ago. He wasn't under the influence, but he was in an accident that killed people, and he got incarcerated for 15 years. And, so I have some experience talking to him about what is happening in there. And there's not a lot of options when you're incarcerated it's not a rehabilitation center. Let's put it that way. So I think the discussion really needs to focus towards what are we doing to bring mental health as one of the challenges, as a core challenge that we need to deal with as a society, and stop having stigma around it, that it's like only crazy people have, mental health challenges. Everybody could use some therapy and have somebody to talk to. And if we make that part of the discussion, maybe we can get to that point where we don't have to have, weapons as one of our deterrents.
One of the issues in the defund the police discussion, and I think there is a very small portion of the population that really wants to get rid of police departments altogether, but is the idea of having other functions taking care of some of the calls that go now to the police, that now go through 911, maybe having mental health people show up. Who has some thoughts on that, of having other services provided not only by somebody who's not carrying a gun and creating maybe that scenario, but also is less expensive to the taxpayer and has more expertise in dealing with the particular issues of mental health or domestic abuse or something like that?
So as a social worker who went into homes all over the county in lots of sort of situations, sometimes with law enforcement support, and I appreciated it when they were there because there needed to be some level of control because we were removing kids from the custody of their parents, and that's potentially not going to make somebody happy, and who knows what happens there. But in all of the other ones, and just in the early dialogues, we didn't have guns. We used to joke, this is how long ago it was for me, we had pagers. That was our big defense mechanism, was our pager and our clipboards. So I think that people can do that, but even social workers or mental health folks need to have a lot of training about de-escalation, because being in the community on the streets and dealing with that is somewhat different than dealing with it in an institution or in an office or in another setting. So there needs to be a lot of training that would be supportive to that. And again, the training to law enforcement to be able to know about de-escalation. And I'm not speaking of an 8-hour class. I'm speaking of maybe hundreds of hours even. And following that up with not just training, but coaching, that there would be people that would debrief situations with persons so they can learn from their experience in the field. What went well, what was problem, what did you learn, and sort of figuring out ways to do that. Because training in itself just kind of sits on the shelf until you need to pull it out, and you might not pull it out in the midst of a crisis. You might just go back to your tried and true ways, which have been tried but aren't really true.
Interesting. Brian, do you have anything you want to jump in on?
Yes, I have a psychology background. I spent some time as a psychiatric technician working for a state hospital. Essentially, a psych tech is is like a mental health LVN, and clinicians worked with law enforcement. We had our own police force in the state hospital, it was a very large facility, and they had police powers just like the ones that you would see, in the surrounding areas for the city. And we saw something that could have worked well, but because of the leadership of that law enforcement branch, there was a very antagonistic relationship between psychology and therapy regarding law enforcement. There was no communication, there was no cooperation of case management. Essentially, they stayed away from us, we stayed away from them, unless an alarm sounded, in which case they came and helped. But there was really no way for us to communicate to them how we needed their help in restraining individuals, in talking them down and de-escalating them. We had no way to say, okay, these are high-risk individuals. These are how we could use law enforcement help in managing them and managing their treatment. It was essentially they were there and they kind of operated on their own. And as a result, there was just that, I think, revealed some of the flaws of why law enforcement has trouble working with with the therapy side of modality regarding regarding patients, and this was in a state facility. But I think that if there was communication, if there was a partnership, if there was a little bit of a higher standard. Sadly, this particular facility was known for hiring police officers that were fired from various cities and could no longer work on the force there.
Yeah.
The lower standards mean that they were brought over there, and as a result, there was this kind of discombobulation. So having seen that, and this is anecdotal, I believe it is possible, and I believe that with communication, there can be a very effective marriage of law enforcement and therapy working together.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that story. One of the things I was wondering is, when do we let a criminal get away? Is there a time to say, instead of killing this person, let them get away? We have their address. Is there a time just to say, instead of killing, let them go? And I think maybe it was Gary or hit on it. We feel really comfortable and safe when people are getting thrown in prison, but it hasn't proven to be effective at taking down crime. And so maybe a philosophical, when do we let people go and let them get away?
It's definitely a challenging question, right? It does happen every day. I know that, high-speed chases, typically they back off because it's just too risky to have somebody crash into other people and they're going 100 miles an hour down the interstate or, down the neighborhood road. Typically those are the scenarios that I know of that you would back off. It gets a little more complex when you're in a face-to-face, it becomes this escalation challenge, right? The cops telling you to do something, you don't want to do it. They feel like now they have to do something because you're not complying, and then it just keeps escalating until something bad comes from that. So I think it's a great question to ask. At what point do you stop trying to try to reset the bar right there on the spot instead of having to have an outcome of somebody's going to jail?
My perception of law enforcement engagement, often it includes sort of command and control, that you need to have command of the situation and control of what's going. And so you give those directives, and when those directives aren't followed, then you escalate that more to make sure that you have that control. And like you said, it's really hard to recalibrate that back down once you've put it up. And so I raised teenagers, and I learned that command and control is a really bad idea. My teenagers may watch this, so I apologize to them. they're wonderful adults. They're the greatest adults in the world. But I learned to be humble as a parent. But command and control, once you set that bar, it could go bad. So to Paul's idea, when is it, you got the information, it's not a threatening, a life-threatening or dangerous kind of interaction, just send them their ticket, or even if they have a warrant, if it's like just a failure to appear for a traffic offense, be good to take them in. But if they're going to give you a whole lot that you end up having to shoot them, maybe it would be better just to, now I know where you live, or I'll follow you, or what, do something and get you at a different point in time.
Might require more legislation to rechange the way we do look at laws, and is a warrant necessary for a failure to appear? What type of escalation are we doing on the books? I mean, it's a very complex issue, and we're in the middle of, people want it solved right now, and it's not something you can solve right now. But the discussions certainly around this can certainly get us moving in the right direction. And just like everything else that's been happening this year and this last, handful of years, awareness, right? How many things are we not aware of where we stand, of what we thought we knew, we didn't realize, that we're not putting ourselves in other people's shoes and positions, and we think we know the answer, and actually we're way off base because we have the wrong perspective. So awareness is I think it'll be a key going forward too.
Let me ask you guys this, and I'm sorry, COVID days of doing these things, my yard guy is outside, so I hope you can't hear it too loud as they're working on our shrubs outside. But how many of you, as we look around, feel like that a person of color, a person from a community of color, is more likely to have a negative interaction with the police officer than, and I'm looking, and we're all some version of Caucasian on the screen, so than us? How many of you do we have a feeling that our friends that are from communities of color have more likely to have a negative interaction with a police officer? Yeah, you can nod your head. Does anybody want to jump in and speak to that?
I don't think it's a feeling. I think it's a reality. I have two daughters, and they've dated quite a number of different people, and they're both have dated young African American men, and they all have the same experience, where it's very challenging, and they've all had encounters that have gone south, which is crazy, right? Because you'd think there at least be some encounters that wouldn't be a bad encounter. But I think it's a rarity to find a Black person that would have no bad experiences with law enforcement. Which, what does that say?
Well, and not just having bad ones, but having them at all when they didn't really do anything. They just looked like the person they were looking for, which equates to, you're a Black guy and I don't see many Black guys around here, so it must be you. Or whatever, stop and frisk, a horrible policy that targeted people. So profiling is there. So definitely.
Yeah, and just when my friend told me about how every African American household has to have the talk of what do you do with your hands when you're stopped by a police officer, and then my friend turned and asked me and said, "Did your dad have that talk with you? Did you have that talk with your kids?" And I had to say, I never even knew there was that talk. I never even knew that was a necessary thing. That was a moment where a light went on for me of like, oh, there's a part of our community that looks at dealing with police officers differently than I've grown up with. And that was a big factor of turning my heart to how I look at some of these things. And again, not against police or individual police officers, but against maybe a systemic mindset. Is that the word we should use? That would cause a police officer to maybe have a belief that this African-American man is just a little more risky for me to deal with than another human being. What do you guys think?
I think it's the outcome of what I mentioned before that happened during Jim Crow. It's happened during our community policing, as it were, that the explanation as to why so many are in jail is that they do bad things more regularly than our people, when in fact they don't. They just get different sentences, the different conviction rates and those kind of things. And so they're in longer and all of those kind of things. And so it's a So Ibram Kendi basically did a really good job of helping me to understand this in his books, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and also in Stamped from the Beginning. So here's my plug for that book, Stamped from the Beginning. But that stereotypes and sort of racist ideas about the nature of people came after the thing that was really the cause, which was the need to exploit the labor to make money. And then they needed some reason to be able to say that it was okay to own another human being. And so then the negative kinds of things that are talked about or perceived about persons of color came. Same thing, then we have to be okay with the fact that they're imprisoned at a higher rate, that they're killed in their communities as well as by law enforcement. And so that's not really a good retort. They say, well, you know, be worried about black on black crime. Well, black on black crime happens because of the conditions within the neighborhood, which are not the fault of bad black people. It's about how the system has drawn that. And so it's not surprising that we have those ideas. It's important then to have good implicit bias training. And again, probably not just a day class, but lots of that kind of conversation and support.
Paul, we keep talking about systemic, and I do want to take a moment to call out the fact that there are some really, really bad cops out there. I mean, we look at the cop that murdered George Floyd. He was just a bad cop. You know, he had numerous different complaints against him. The union had defended him, and he really should have just been off the force nationwide and found a different job doing something else. It clearly was not his calling in life. So I think it is important that we hold that in tension, that we've got some systemic problems. We've got some extremely racist individuals. We've got some individuals with just anger problems, you know, that they shouldn't be carrying a gun because that's their personality isn't such that they can handle that well. And then, yeah, we definitely do have some other very decent people that are trying to work within this system that has created a mess.
I think you raise a point of transparency, right? If we're giving people the right to carry a gun and make life and death decisions, they should be the most transparent organization out there, particularly if it's taxpayer funded, right? And sometimes if you start to feel like the police will close ranks around each other when something controversial happens and that trust starts to break down, that maybe that's part of what we're seeing in this time that we need as citizens to demand and encourage our police to be so transparent that trust is earned and not lost in any feeling that the police are going to rally around each other in this thing. And maybe, how much do you guys think cell phones has been a big part of starting to bring this reality to bear for other parts of the community as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of people have asked the question of, well, what was different about George Floyd, you know, versus any number of other times where similar situations have happened. And, you know, I think there were a number of things that were different, but one of the things was the cell phone, that you could watch for that painful 8 minutes and 46 seconds and go, oh my gosh, this is happening for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. That's a really long time. That's longer than it takes to cook my oatmeal. You know, it's an extremely long period of time, and you could hear the jokes that these cops were making. And I don't recall in that situation whether they were explicitly racist, but the guy who was killing him was making jokes, and you can see that and go, oh my gosh, this is way more than just, wow, this guy got a little out of hand.
And in the past, it would have just been a police officer saying he tried to resist arrest. His buddy would say, yes, he did. And that would be it, I guess. And so even going back to Rodney King, I guess the invention of video cameras has sort of changed this. But let me finish with this as we come down the stretch here. And maybe I'd like each of you to talk about this. Like, where should our heart posture be at a time when some are yelling Black Lives Matter, some are yelling All Lives Matter, some are flying Blue Lives Matter flags? How are you navigating this as a human being in watching what you're seeing in both the police incidents, the protests that get ugly, that some would call riots and thugs, and maybe others are getting, interlopers are coming in there and causing trouble? how are you managing your heart and your relationships in the midst of it all? Who wants to start on that?
Sure, I can take a start on that. I know that for me, the heart posture is um, just looking around and having compassion and wanting to build the relationships. I know in our family, last several years we've been living by the motto of, do we want to be right or do you want to understand? So I think when you take a perspective, do you want to be right or do you want to understand? It opens up a whole lot more doors to look at the situations that are happening around you and understand why it's happening and understand why are people doing what they're doing? Why is there a reaction this way? And there's been discussions like, well, I'm just going to move out of this city because it's going downhill so bad. I don't want to deal with any of that. And my wife was like, no, we're not going to move. You know what we're going to do? We're going to engage. We're going to engage. So people, instead of like running from the problem, how do we engage? And how do we engage? We can engage by having interactions and relationships with the people that are around us, with the ones you are in your sphere of influence. It's such a large issue, but and we can't tackle it from a high level. We can tackle it from, who am I in relationship with, and how can I have these conversations? And I think that's what, Paul, you're trying to do with what you do, and Lauren, these conversations just open up awareness. And what we can do individually is get out into your neighborhood and start asking the question, help me understand what's happening with the people that you have a sphere of influence on.
So a consideration I have is I want to look at this from scripture, and the current issue of Christianity Today magazine has a really good article in that regard by Esau. It's an interesting combination, sort of an Irish name and I'm not sure where else from, but it's an African-American Anglican priest. But what he talks about is that in Romans 13, the first two verses talk about obey the government. But verse 3 says that rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of authority? Then do what is good and you will receive approval. What he's saying there is what God expects of the structures that guide your behavior. John the Baptist was asked about what should happen, and basically he says, don't extort money, don't create false lies about people. But there's an awareness that those structures sometimes don't do that. In fact, the structures that killed Jesus, framed him basically. And so, Jesus understands when that goes badly because it was true for him. But God really desires us to have systems, even though it's not a Christian, so it's not a theocracy, it's not a God government mix. There's still an expectation that as Christians, we would advocate for the heart of God, which is for systems to act in a just manner. So these conversations for that reason become very, very important.
Well said.
My heart posture is when looking towards the people who do believe that everything that they value is being threatened by African Americans, by anybody with skin a shade darker than theirs, by all of that together. I can't. What I would say to them as a people group is, I can't make you look at these people as equally valued as you are in the eyes of the Father. I can't convince you that for years and years, Blacks have not been lying when they've said all over the country that police are killing us. I can't make you feel a certain level of compassion for Breonna Taylor or George Floyd. I can't make you step into their shoes and say, what if this had happened to a white family? What I can do is say that I will fight for social justice and a more equitable system that will, believe it or not, benefit you in the long run, provide for more equality, and bring a drop in crime, because it will be addressing the factors that promote it. And I say this out of love, and I say this out of honor, that you may think that we are working against you, but in reality, we are working for you and everyone else.
So good. Love it, Brian. Thank you.
Yeah,
Lo-
no,
Lauren.
that's really well said, Brian. I think the one other thing I would add to what's already been shared, which I think has been really spot on, is when for me this was a large part of my journey towards moving out of being right wing. Was I looked at the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, Isaiah, where Jesus is separating the sheep and the goats. I kept looking at these passages and going, boy, the Bible sure seems to come down on the side of the oppressed, the imprisoned, the sick, the poor, the destitute, the widow, the orphan, an awful lot of the time. there's very few times where Jesus, the apostles, the prophets, any of these people come down on the side or the favor of the people that are doing just fine and are in charge and have power. And that really challenged me to go, if I'm going to say I follow Jesus and I follow the Bible, I need to come down on the same side that the Bible and Jesus did, and go, no, I need to favor the poor, the destitute, the hungry, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and look after those people like Jesus said to.
Good stuff. And I would echo a lot of what you guys are saying. And the Bible has a menu item for having a healthy land. And it says, God's people should humble themselves, pray and seek his face and turn from their wicked ways. Doesn't say get other people to turn from their wicked ways, get other people to stop sinning. It says, no, God says, if my people will humble themselves, seek my face, pray, turn from their ways, then will I hear from heaven and I'll heal their land. And I think this is a season where I'm trying to tell Christians, stop pointing at those people. And in fact, if you ever use the term those people, stop and think about who you're pointing at and who you're calling those people, because now you've created a division, you've created a class system of me versus them. And is that ever Christ-like, as Lauren and the rest of you have said? So I love the idea, Gary, that you're saying, help me understand, use that as a question. And so I talk a lot about proximity. In this season, find somebody who disagrees with your stance and go sit with them. Get a Zoom call with them, whatever it takes, socially distanced coffee, and say, tell me your life story. Tell me about you, and let your heart be humbled. And then I think we give an opportunity for God's help to come in and heal the land. And the one other thing I'll finish with is, and don't be manipulated in this political season. There are those that want to make you afraid. There's been a couple of conventions going on, and part of the goal is to make you afraid of the other team. And there is actually a concerted effort to make us afraid of each other. And we just have to refuse to be manipulated by politics in this and say, no, I'm going to be like Christ. I'm going to humble myself, lay down my weapons. And I think then that starts to filter in everything that we do. So good stuff, guys. Anybody else have anything else they want to jump in before we go?
I think if we just approach everything with love, right? Love wins.
Love it. 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And so good stuff. Well, hey, Brian, Gary, David, Lauren, thank you guys so much for joining us for the conversation. I think this is helpful, Lauren. Maybe we do some more of these on some other topical stuff. What do you think?
That's our goal. We're planning on doing these once a week and are looking for topics. So feel free to private message any of us, or again on Intersecting Faith and Politics. We're collecting topics on there. So again, that's facebook.com/groups/intersecting faith and politics.
Yep. And the website is nonpartisan evangelical npepodcast.com, or the NPE Facebook page and YouTube channel and all that good stuff. Real pleasure, guys. I don't know if we solved the world's problems, but maybe we help some people sort of think some things through. So great stuff. Thanks for bringing your brilliance and your heart and hanging out with us today. And thanks to all of you watching on Facebook. We'll see you again on Intersecting Faith and Politics and the Nonpartisan Evangelical Discussions.